There is a photograph taken with a folding camera on a hot morning in the summer of 1928 of Elissa Tull at the edge of the Sevier Desert, 23 years old, in a widow's black dress cut down and re-hemmed by her own hand, a burro named Radish behind her, and her father's brass salt tester in her belt like a knife. She was walking west across the playa to find a town she had been told, all her life, did not exist. A settlement called Kelsey Bar that had been erased from every map of Utah Territory in the year 1848 and had, according to Fillmore, never been there in the first place. Fillmore was wrong. Her father's papers said so. She meant to prove it and to open whatever the salt had kept, if the salt had kept anything at all. If a story about a woman who trusted her father's word against a whole town is worth 2 seconds of your evening, take that second and hit the subscribe button and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. It helps the channel, and it helps the folks who need this kind of story find their way to it. Her name was Elissa Tull. She was born in Fillmore in the shadow of the Pavant Range in the wet spring of 1905. In a plank house her father had built himself on the strength of one paid claim. Her father was Whitcomb Tull, a Welsh convert who had come out to Utah as a boy in 1862 in the last of the handcart companies, and who had learned salt work at the age of 14 from a Danish playa man named Peter Nielsen, and had made his living the rest of his days walking the dry lake beds of the Sevier and reading the crystals. Her mother was Rhoda Bright Tull, whose father had run a salt-hauling string out of Nephi in the 80s, and whose family word for a daughter was Cariad in the Welsh, meaning beloved. Rhoda was 32 when Elissa was born and had lost 2 babies before. Elissa was, in the household, the one who was going to live. She was going to live, and she was going to know what her father knew. That was the arrangement in the Tull house. Her father took her out on the playas from the time she was 5. He put her in a straw hat and a pair of boys' overalls cut short and a canteen with a rag over the mouth, and he made her a salt hand. She learned to read the color banding of a dry lake bed the way another girl learned to read a hymnal. She learned that a playa is not, as townspeople said, a dead thing. It is a slow ledger, and every wheel and every hoof and every wind that has crossed it has left a mark that the salt takes down in its own language. And the language is legible if the reader is patient. She learned that a wagon wheel crossing a wet playa in summer will bruise the underlayer of salt and be visible in the right light. 70 years later, that a wagon crossing a dry playa in winter will leave a faint pinkish groove where the mineral of the iron tire has migrated slowly outward, that a dead lake bed lifts and settles and recrystallizes in seasonal cycles. But the wheels and the hooves show through the cycles if you know where to stand to catch the light. She learned to use her father's salt tester. It was a brass tube the length of her forearm, with a small screw handle at one end and a hardened point at the other, and it drew a plug of playa crust that a man could taste for mineral, or measure with a ring gauge for grain density, or lay against a paper strip to read for iron and copper. Her father had used one for 40 years. He had made his own at a Fillmore forge from Welsh brass, and it was, along with his hymnal and his wife, the most expensive thing he owned. He gave it to Elissa on her 12th birthday and said, "Cariad, this is yours. The trade is yours. The playas do not care that you are a girl, and neither do I." She was in every way her father's daughter. Her mother died in the winter of 1916 of a fever nobody in Fillmore was able to name. In 3 days, Elissa was 11. She sat by her mother's bed and read her the Welsh Psalter, and her mother, on the last morning, put a hand on Elissa's head and called her Cariad and closed her eyes and did not open them again. Whitcomb wept for a week in the shed, and then he did not weep. He raised Elissa on the road, on the playas, in the salt camps, and taught her and did not remarry, for a while at least. He remarried when Elissa was 17, to a widow named Tacy Knibb from Beaver, whom he met at a stake conference, and married in a small brief ceremony 4 months later. Tacy was not unkind at first. She was 39, childless, and glad of a house. She was correct with Elissa. She kept a good table. She did not, in the first 2 years, cross Whitcomb once about the salt trade or Elissa's part in it. Whitcomb died in the wet spring of 1926 of a lung sickness that took him fast. He was 59. On the second morning of the illness, when he could still speak, he called Elissa to his bedside and put a leather packet into her hand and said, "Carry it. When the time comes, walk it. It is real. The salt has been keeping it." He would not tell her more. He said Tacy was not to know. He said the packet was for her. Elissa did not open it until after the funeral. She did not open it, in fact, for 6 months, because the 6 months after her father's funeral were full of the domestic war her stepmother turned out to be capable of, and Elissa was in it every day. Tacy produced, 4 weeks after the funeral, a will Whitcomb had allegedly signed in the last week of his life, leaving all, the plank house, the claim on the Fillmore playa, the salt tester, the burro string, to Tacy herself in trust for a nephew of hers in Beaver, with a provision that Elissa be given $100 and a passage to Salt Lake, to enter the millinery trade if she wished. Elissa read the will. The signature was Whitcomb's. The date was a lie. Whitcomb had, on that date, been unable to hold a spoon, and Elissa knew it. But so did every man in Fillmore. Tacy had gotten to witness the paper, and none of them would speak up. Elissa did not fight the will in court. She had no money to fight it with, and she did not, in the summer of 1926, believe a judge in Millard County would rule against a widow with a Beaver testimony behind her. She took her $100. In a Caro syrup tin, she had painted the inside of black for privacy. She took her father's brass salt tester, which Tacy had not thought to put in the inventory. She took her mother's Welsh salter. She took her father's playa notebooks, which Tacy had thought were only bookkeeping. She took Kellen, the small mongrel dog Whitcomb had brought home from a salt camp in 1922 and who had slept under Whitcomb's cot every night since. She took, above all, the leather packet. She opened the packet on the third night in a boarding house in Nephi, by the light of a coal oil lamp with Kellen against her leg. Inside the packet were 3 things: a small hand-drawn map of the Sevier Desert, with a line running west from the Fillmore playa across the north end of the Sevier Lake bed to a place her father had marked with a small K in a circle. A letter, in her father's hand, telling her that the place marked K was the buried town of Kelsey Bar, which had been washed out and salted over in the flood of 1848 and erased from the survey maps within a year of the erasure at the request of 2 church officials and 1 federal marshal, on the grounds that the settlement had not been sanctioned and had best be left forgotten, and, folded flat, a testament. Whitcomb's copy, taken by his own hand from an old book he had found in a Beaver estate sale in the year 1912, of a document written by one Erastus Comerford, who had been mayor of Kelsey Bar in the year of the flood, addressed to a son who had left the town 3 years before it was erased, and never delivered. Erastus Comerford said her father's letter had put the testament and something more into a strong box and buried the strong box under the altar of the Kelsey Bar Chapel in the last week before the flood. He had died in the flood. The strong box was, so far as Whitcomb had been able to establish, still there. Her father wrote that he had walked out to the site of Kelsey Bar twice, once in 1918 and once in 1922, and had found the outline of the town under the salt on the second trip. He had not opened the strong box. He had wanted to leave it for her. He wrote, in the last line of the letter, Carriad, this is why I taught you to read the salt. She walked west out of Fillmore on the third morning of July in 1928 with the burro radish, the dog Kellen, the salt tester in her belt, the Caro tin in her pack, and the map folded inside her father's notebook against her ribs. She was 23. The town of Fillmore watched her go. The gossip that followed her out onto the playa said the widow's daughter had gone crazy in her grief and had walked out to die of thirst, chasing her father's ghost. The gossip was, as gossip usually is, half right. She was chasing her father. She did not mean to die of it. The Sevier Desert is a hard place in July. She walked at first light and at dusk, and lay under Radish's shadow through the noon. She used her father's methods. She read the crust color. She followed a faint pinkish groove west across the north edge of the Sevier Lake bed for a full day before she was sure it was a wagon groove and not a natural mineral flow. It was a wagon groove. It was, from the density and the age of the underlayer, a groove from the 1840s. She was walking the salt road that the Kelsey Bar wagons had once run to Fillmore. The town had said the road did not exist. The salt said otherwise. She had, in Fillmore, met her mentor. His name was Absalom Farr. He was 72, a retired salt hauler who had run a string out of Nephi in the 80s before his knees quit him. He lived in a small cabin on the north edge of Fillmore, and he had been a friend of Whitcomb's for 30 years, and he had grieved for Whitcomb quietly at the funeral and had come to Elissa afterward and said, "If you are your father's daughter, come by, and I will tell you what he did not have time to." She had gone by. She had spent 3 weeks of April with him on the playa, learning the finer grade of what her father had begun. Absalom had told her, on their second afternoon on the Fillmore playa, the aphorism that would sit with her the rest of her life. He had said, "The salt takes every wheel that crosses it." That is the promise of the trade. What you have to remember is that the salt does not know a good wheel from a bad one. It will read a thief the same as it will read a mayor. Do not judge what you read. Only read it. He said it with his hand flat on the salt and his eyes half closed. She would repeat it silently on the playa 100 times. The two Fillmore skeptics she had left behind were Silas Gurn, the ward bishop who had told her over the fence that her father's story of a buried town was a heat vision and no more, and Amelia Blake, who ran the post office and who had leaned across her counter and said the widow's daughter would be back in a week, thinner and wiser. Neither of them was her real trouble. Her real trouble was Tacy Knibb, who had, the day Elissa left Fillmore, filed with the county to have Whitcomb's brass salt tester recovered as estate property. Elissa had read the notice and put it in the Caro tin under her $100. She meant to answer it when she came back. She meant to come back with an answer. She reached the north end of the Sevier Lake bed on the second morning. She reached, on the third, the shallow rise the map called Comerford's Bench. From the top of the bench she could see, in the low light of an early sun, the shape of a buried thing on the playa below her. It was not at first obvious. It was, once she saw it, unmistakable. A darker rectangle in the salt, then another, then a third, then a whole grid. A whole thing that had been a town, streets and lots and a central square, buried under 2 feet of salt and half a foot of drift sand, laid out as if a hand had pressed a rubbing paper over it. She stood on the bench a long time. She said aloud, "There you are." She said it to her father. She said it, in some way, to Erastus Comerford. She walked down onto the town. Kellen ran ahead, then stopped, then came back and sat by her boot. Radish would not come off the bench. She left him tied to the one juniper the bench had. She walked to the center of the town alone with the dog. If you're new here, and this is finding you tonight, at a hard time, we're glad you're here. We make one of these every Friday, and every kind comment helps the next one find us. She found the chapel on the second morning of digging. It was in the center of the town, as chapels always are, and the salt had preserved it as glass preserves an insect. The outer wall, standing to a height of about 4 feet where the drift had not scoured, the roof collapsed inward, and encased in a lens of hard salt crust, the door lintel, visible under a foot of white powder. She excavated it with a small camp shovel and her father's brass salt tester and, in the last stretch, with her hands. Kellen dug beside her, then lost interest, then sat and watched. She uncovered the door frame by the noon of the second day. There was no door left. She stepped through into the chapel. The floor was still there. The pews had rotted and collapsed, but their outlines were on the boards. The altar was still there, at the far end. A small wooden altar with a plain rail, coated in salt crust an inch thick, standing as if it had been waiting. She walked up to the altar, with the sun coming down from the collapsed roof and the dog at her heel, and she stood there a moment and did not touch anything. She knelt. She began to clear. She cleared the altar first. She used the flat of her hand to brush the salt off. The wood beneath was cottonwood, still solid. She used the salt tester to score the crust at the base of the altar. She lifted the loose slab of crust off and set it aside. She knelt lower and looked under the altar. There was a flagstone sunk into the floor at the altar's foot. That was not the same color as the boards around it. Her father's map had marked this. She had come across half a state to find this flagstone. She lifted it with the salt tester and her fingers. It came up easier than she had feared. Under it was a hollow the size of a small trunk, dry, salt-lined, and in the hollow was a strong box, cast iron, hinged, sealed with a hasp and a padlock, the color of dried blood. She lifted the box out. She set it on the altar. She sat back on her heels. She stayed still for a minute. Then she began to open it. The padlock had rusted solid. She could not turn the shackle. She used the brass salt tester as a wedge. That was what a salt tester was, at heart, when it was not being a salt tester. And she struck the blunt end with a river stone she had brought in her pocket for exactly this purpose. The shackle rang. It did not give. She struck it a second time. It rang, did not give. She struck it a third time, harder, with both hands on the stone, and it broke, a clean break, and the pieces of the lock fell against the altar with the small musical sound old iron makes. She lifted the lid. Money, not gold, silver, coined silver, territorial silver, half-dollars and dollars, in a canvas bag that had rotted through and let the coins settle against the walls of the box. Below the coins, a folded oilcloth packet, tied with a leather cord. She counted with her eyes. She would count with her hands later. She would learn the count came to something over $5,000 in silver at the coin value alone, and something over $8,000 at the collector value, which she would learn to think of separately. She did not touch the packet first. She sat, one moment, with her hands on either side of the box and her breath coming slow. Then she took the packet out. She untied the cord. Inside the oilcloth were two things: a slim ledger book, in a neat pinched hand, which she recognized at once as Erastus Comerford's, the same hand her father had copied for her, and a single letter addressed to Josiah Comerford, care of the postmaster at Cedar City, in the year 1848, never delivered. She read the letter. It was not long. Erastus Comerford told his son Josiah that he was sorry. He said Josiah had been right to leave. He said he had told Josiah 3 years before that a mayor could not leave the town he had helped to plant, even when the town had begun to make the wrong turns. He said, Josiah had said, in return, that a father who could not leave the town could not follow his son either. Erastus said Josiah had been right about that too. He wrote, and Elissa would remember these lines, as she had remembered her father's, that he had held every family in Kelsey Bar in his hand for 30 years, and had let his own well go dry. because his boy had gone and his wife had gone with him, and he had stayed to hold the town. And the town, in the end, would not save him from the flood. He wrote that if the flood came, and if the strongbox was ever found, he would like whoever found it to know one thing, that the silver in it had been the town's treasury, and it had been meant for a school, and he had wished, at the end, that he had spent it on a horse and a ticket to Cedar City instead. He wrote that a man who holds a town together and cannot hold his own family is not the man he had thought he was. He signed his name. Under it, in a smaller hand, he wrote, "Cariad, my boy, if the salt returns this to you, hold it. Then buy the horse, Cariad, in Welsh." She had not known Erastus Comerford was Welsh. She looked up from the letter. She looked around the empty chapel with the sun on the salt. She said aloud, in the empty room, "Oh." She sat there a long time. Kellen came under her elbow. She copied the letter into her father's playa notebook, word for word, in pencil. She refolded Erastus Comerford's original in the oilcloth. She whispered Josiah Comerford's name aloud. She did not know then whether the son had lived out his life in Cedar City or gone further. She would find out. She hauled the strongbox up to the bench on Radish that afternoon. She camped one more night at the town and walked out east at first light. She walked east for 4 days. She reached Fillmore in the second week of July, dusty, thinner, with a burro that had lost 20 pounds and a dog that was as tired as a small dog gets, and she went to Absalom Farr's cabin first because she owed him the news first. He read the letter. He set it down. He did not speak for a minute. Then he said, "Cariad." He wrote it in your mother's language. She nodded. He said, "Whitcomb chose the right daughter." She wept once, briefly, into the sleeve of her cut-down widow's dress. Absalom sat with her. The Comerford family, they learned, had not stayed in Cedar City. Josiah Comerford had gone on to Salt Lake City after the flood took his father and had lived out his life there and had died in 1911. But he had left descendants, 3 grandchildren, and one of them, a woman named Meredith Comerford Ashe, ran a small independent bookshop in Salt Lake and was 70 years old and had, all her life, known only that her great-grandfather had been the mayor of a town nobody had heard of. Elissa took the train to Salt Lake with Meredith's address in her pocket and Kellen in a basket at her feet. Meredith Ashe received her in the back office of the bookshop with a cup of tea and a listening look. Elissa put the packet down between them. Meredith Ashe read the letter. She read it twice. She looked up. She said, "My grandfather told his own children, until the day he died, that he did not know if his father had ever wanted him back." Elissa said, "He did. It's on the paper." Meredith Ashe held Elissa's hand a long minute. They drank the tea. Elissa went back to Fillmore by way of the Millard County Recorder's office. She hired a small young Salt Lake lawyer Absalom had named. She showed him the will Tacy had produced, and she showed him her father's dated playa notebook, and she showed him Whitcomb's own hand on every day of the illness, which proved that Whitcomb Tull had not held a pen on the date the transfer was said to have been signed. The lawyer, in his small, quiet way, filed a suit. It took him 90 days. The court struck the transfer, the plank house, the claim on the Fillmore playa, and the salt tester came back to Elissa as Whitcomb Tull's only child. Tacy Knibb left Fillmore inside the month. Her nephew from Beaver went with her. Elissa moved back into her father's plank house on the north edge of Fillmore in the wet spring of 1929. In the last months before the Depression came out west, and she rebuilt the porch and repainted the shutters herself. She kept the brass salt tester on the mantel and the Caro tin on the shelf and her father's playa notebooks on the desk by the window. She founded, out of the silver from Kelsey Bar, a small salt reading service that supplied playa work for the County Road Commission and for the University of Utah Geology Department, and for 20 years thereafter, She was the person to hire for any project on the Sevier that required a lake bed dated or a wagon route recovered. She trained 3 apprentices. She paid them fair. Kellen is buried at the fence corner nearest the West Road, where he liked to sit and look at the desert. There is a flat sandstone over him with his name scratched in with a nail. Radish lived out his days on a Fillmore farm and was rented out to Absalom's grandsons for playa expeditions until he was 29 years old. Absalom died in 1932 in his own bed, with Elissa reading him the Welsh Psalter that her mother had read to her. His last word was Cariad. Elissa did not marry. She was courted gently by a Fillmore lawyer and, less gently, by a Salt Lake geologist. She said of them both that she was grateful and unavailable. She kept her braid. She kept her father's brass salt tester in her belt on the playa. She kept the copy she had made of Erastus Comerford's letter in a drawer with her father's notebooks. She built the school Erastus Comerford had wanted to build in Kelsey Bar. She built it in Fillmore. She named it the Comerford School and paid for its first 10 years out of the silver from the buried town. Some things a person understands late. Elissa understood, over the years, that Erastus Comerford had held Kelsey Bar together for 30 years by pouring himself into it and had let his own well go dry. His boy gone, his wife gone with the boy, his salt tester dropped into the flood, and had died, still holding a town that would not save him. Her father had done a smaller version of the same thing, and had corrected it just in time. Absalom had corrected his in another way, by never marrying and never regretting it. She herself, she thought sometimes on the porch, with a cup of tea in her hand, was to be the correction of both of them, a woman who held a school in one hand and a salt tester in the other, and did not give either up, and did not at any age forget to buy the horse. Fillmore said, the summer Elissa Tull walked out into the desert, that the salt road led nowhere. The salt disagreed. So did Kelsey Bar in its buried, patient way. If you have ever been told that a road you were walking led nowhere, drop a comment below and tell us what you found at the end of it. I read them all. See you in the next one.